Hello, and welcome back to the Goodness Margin, the place where we find margin for the good things in life. Today, I'm going to share with you 5 tips for budgeting. Whether you've been budgeting for a long time, maybe there'll be something new here that you haven't done before, or if you're just getting started with a budget. So for many people, the word budget can kind of seem like a bad word. It's a word that we don't really want to use. We can look at it as something that's negative. But the reality is that it doesn't matter how much money we make, how little money we make, we need to budget. A budget is essentially how much money is coming in versus how much goes out. And we can outline in those areas what we expect to spend and what we have budgeted for, meaning what we plan to spend for each of those categories. Now, once we have what comes in versus what goes out, what we have spent, income minus expenses, we definitely hope to have a positive number there. We can also have what is called a zero-based budget, where that we have what comes in and then what goes out is exactly that same amount where the ending balance is 0. We'll talk a little bit more about that in tip number 5, where that you can take that money that is left over and designate where you want to spend that. So let's get started with tip number 1. Let's look at what we have been spending. If you are starting a budget, you want to look at what you have been spending. If you've been spending $200 a week on groceries and you want to budget $100 a week on groceries, you're going to have to be really intentional about that, and that might be a little bit too difficult to do. So when we're determining what we're going to spend in each category or what our plan is, we really need to look at what we have been spending. That way we can see these are areas that I've been spending too much, or I'm not spending as much as I thought there. There are some areas that can change by something that you can do, and then sometimes there are areas that they just are what they are. Maybe your rent or your house payment. This amount is what it is, and it's not going to be changing at least for another year, and so I know this is staying. But as far as my food budget goes, how much I eat out or how much I spend on groceries, I can definitely change that one way or the other to affect my budget. So we need to look at what we have been spending to have more of an accurate depiction of what the picture of our budget really looks like. Tip number 2 is to reevaluate. My husband and I have been married for 19 and a half years, and the entire marriage we have had a budget. Now, there have been different times where we've really tried to be more intentional and followed that budget better than other times, but we've always had a budget. Sometimes we've used a notepad, sometimes I've used a spreadsheet, I've used a book, I've used various things, but we've always used a budget, and I've always had to come back and reevaluate that budget because things change. If you're just getting started in this budgeting journey, it will probably take you about 3 months to really create a truly accurate budget. But then, even if you've been using the same budget for a long time, for many years now, I've been using the same spreadsheet for the budget that our household uses. I have had to recently really reevaluate some categories. As you all know, inflation has been pretty high here lately, and so gas prices have really changed. I've had to drastically change my fuel and my grocery budgeting categories. Well, by increasing those, I've had to be intentional about decreasing some other areas of my budget. So it's important that even if you've been doing a budget for a long time, that you go back and you make sure that that budget is still working for you, that those numbers are still the same numbers that you need to have in that budget. Tip number 3 is to schedule regular check-ins. This can be as often or as not so often as you like. I definitely recommend checking your budget at least once a week. I do this on Mondays. I'll go through my budget and see where we're at. It's important for me to know that if we're halfway through the month and I've spent 75% of our grocery budget, I really need to look at, okay, what are we going to do the rest of the month? How can I be more intentional about cooking from things that are already in my pantry, that are already in my freezer, and not spending as much money? We need to check in on a regular basis. Sometimes people, when they're first getting started, they'll check in daily to see where they're at on their budget. Very important that you check in regularly. And if you're married, it's important that you schedule a time that you and your spouse will look at the budget together. My husband and I do this on our Money Mondays. It's the first Monday of every month, and we sit down and we look at what did we spend last month? How did we deal with the budget last month? Did we stay on track? And then what is the budget like for this month? What kind of expenses are we expecting? And where do we need to cut back, or what are we trying to save for during this current season of life? Scheduling regular check-ins is really important. Tip number 4 is use cash when you can. Cash really can be king. Now, I know that sometimes there's certain categories for myself, like fuel, I'd rather not use cash. Many times I have the kids in the car. I'd like to just pull up, swipe my card, and pay at the pump. But then there are other categories that I do want to use cash for. And especially if you're just getting started with budgeting, maybe you've been overspending in certain categories, cash is a way to really put the brakes on spending. You have this much cash and you have this much to spend in this category, and when it's gone, it's gone. So when you can use cash, I feel like it's a really great way to be very intentional and to really put a visual on exactly how much money you're spending and where your money's going. One tip for keeping track of the cash that you spend is to save those receipts, and then when you get home, you can pull them out of your wallet and categorize them as to what you've spent. Or sometimes, if I don't have a receipt, like the other day I took my son to get a haircut and I think it was $23. And so I made a note in my phone on my reminders app. And that way, when it was time for me to look at my budget, I could just quickly check that and mark that off that I've written down that I spent $23 on a haircut. Tip number 5 is to use sinking funds. We all have categories that we have to spend a certain amount of money or a larger sum of money during a certain time of year. For example, Christmas, or maybe you do a big Easter dinner for your family. And so you're going to be spending a little bit more than your regular allotted grocery budget during that time. Well, you can create what is called a sinking fund. And you can determine, I am going to be saving $20 a month towards Christmas, whatever the amount is. Let's say you want to save $1,200 for Christmas. Well, that's easy. Every month, be sure to save $100 towards Christmas. We personally have a credit union, and we are able to have as many savings accounts as we want. I have one additional savings account that is not our emergency fund, but it is for our sinking funds. And I will use a spreadsheet to categorize what I have saved for in those categories. You can use the sinking fund for anything. If you're wanting to go on a trip, or maybe you're saving for some furniture or some clothing, or maybe even back to school. If you see that back to school is a time that really puts a crunch on your budget, then start saving in January. Save $20 a month, and that way you'll have a good amount of money when it's time for back to school that you can utilize for that. Sinking funds are a great way for us to save for those expenses that are not unexpected. We know they're going to happen, but sometimes they feel like an unexpected expense if we haven't really planned for those. These are just some simple ways, some simple tips that I use when we're budgeting. Budgeting is something that is really important to do. No matter how great or how bad the economy is doing, we all have income and we all have expenses. And so it's really important to know where our money is going. I'd love to hear from you. What's your favorite budgeting tip? Drop it in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, I would love for you to subscribe to my channel. You can hit the bell to be notified when the next video goes live.